Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for your attendance. I would like to welcome you all here to this series of invited lectures towards a comprehensive measurement of well-being. My name is Emilio López, and today's lecture is about innovations in household survey methodology by Professor Paul Smith. I will now introduce Professor Paul Smith to the audience. Professor Paul Smith graduated in botany and maths from University of Wales, Bangor, and has a master's degree in statistics from Sheffield University. He worked for 25 years in the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, spending most of that time in the methodology area. Paul is a member of the Royal Statistical Society and an elected member of the International Statistical Institute and a member of the International Association of Survey Statisticians and the International Association for Official Statistics. He is the discussion papers editor for the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society and an associate editor for the journal Survey Methodology and the Journal of Official Statistics. Paul Smith joined the Southampton Statistical Science Research Institute, the SRI, in September 2014 and is now Professor of Official Statistics. He has particular interest in sampling and estimation methods in government surveys. In today's session, Professor Paul Smith will share his extensive experience in the theory and practice of sample surveys applied to businesses, households, and the population census. I'd like to turn it over to Paul. Professor, could you please begin? We have 25 minutes for your presentation and then 30 minutes for questions and answers.
Okay, great. Do you see my slides?
Yes. For the participants, please write down all your questions in the chat and I will read them to Professor Paul after his presentation.
Okay, fantastic. I'm really pleased to be here. I wish I was there in person, but I'm still at home. I have to work here for a little bit longer, but I'm delighted to be able to come and talk about this topic of innovations in household survey methodology. I have a little outline of what I will try to cover, but we'll see how the time goes and how much I get through from these topics. So we'll start with something about longitudinal sampling designs and different processes for those, and then think a little bit about how to design a sample when you're in a position with lots of different variables. So if we have multivariate concepts such as well-being or multi-purpose surveys which collect many types of variables, some of the challenges around those. We'll think about measuring changes, particularly with rotating panels. And then we'll look a little bit at imputation and weighting for longitudinal sampling designs. And then I have a few conclusions. And you get to ask me some questions at the end. So let's start with longitudinal surveys and those types of designs. So I'm thinking here about panel designs and rotating panel designs, and the ideas behind those are all based on the variances of changes. So the variance of the difference between a variable x measured at time 2 and the same variable x measured at time 1. So I have here variance of x2 minus x1, and we all know from our elementary statistics courses, if you came to university, that's the variance of x2 plus the variance of x1 minus twice the covariance of x2 and x1. So if I can make the covariance between x2 and x1 big, then I get to make the variance of the difference small. So these surveys, longitudinal surveys, are all about maximizing that covariance, and the best way to do that is to make sure that we have the same units in the panel in the sample or on more than one occasion. So if I look on the right hand side of the screen, I don't know if you see my mouse. First I look here at panels. So these typically used in big infrastructure surveys, which might be funded by a research body. And in this case, you take a sample of people which is in the survey for a long time. I say forever, but as long as you want to ask them. And this type of panel, which follows the same people time after time, has some challenges. So we have attrition, which is when people drop out of a survey, they no longer want to participate because they don't have enough. So we have to have methods to deal with those people who drop out of the survey. And we also have a challenge around panel conditioning, which is that people get trained by the process of every year or every 2 years answering a set of questions. They get trained in the method of answering questions, so then they're not always the same as everybody else in the population. And because we have this attrition with loss of sample members, then there may be a need every now and again to have a boost sample, some extra sample to make up for these losses. And to make sure that the sample stays representative of the population. So that's panel surveys, which are not so much in official statistics, but more in infrastructure. A rotating panel is much more typical for official statistics type surveys. Here we have a fixed time in a survey, so somebody will be in for a specified number of periods. Because they're in for only a certain number of periods, then that gives us a more limited amount of information. We don't see the whole of that person's life as they evolve with the survey, because they stop after a small number of years or a small number of months or quarters. Because it's a smaller time in the survey, there's less impact of this attrition. There's less time for people to drop out, although they still do, and there's less opportunity for the panel conditioning. The other big advantage is that because the sample is continually updated, so every period we add a new sample. It's like having a boost every new period, but we lose some sample to make up for it. Then we're able to keep a sample which is basically representative for the population as the population evolves. As I say, those are typical in national statistical institutes. I've put on the bottom of my slide some references which are important in the places they come, rather than me putting them at the end. So here's one for different types of designs in longitudinal surveys. So now let's look a little more at a rotating panel design. So if I want to set up a new panel, there are some things that I need to decide, which will include how much overlap I'm looking for in my survey in particular periods. So I might want, if it's a monthly design, I may want some monthly overlap so that I can measure monthly change. Or I may want some annual overlap so that I have good measures of annual change. Or maybe I want some of both. And depending on what I want, that may make the field operation, the actual collection of the data, more or less complex. I can also think about how many or what fraction of cases are new every period, so what the rotation gives me, typically because in the field the new cases cost more. It's harder to get an interview the first time. So we might want to limit the proportion of new cases. And I've given you just 4 example designs here, using some terminology that was developed by David Steele, who's an Australian academic who also worked in official statistics. So he has an in for 8 design, which is like the Australian Labour Force Survey, and the Australian LFS interviews people for 8 months in a row. So it's in for 8 months. Then there's the US Current Population Survey, which interviews people for 4 months, and then gives them 8 months when there's no interview, and then comes back and interviews them again for 4 more months. And you can see that the 2 4s there overlap over a year. So that we call a 484 design. The UK Labour Force Survey has a similar idea, so that's interviewing people every quarter. So this is 1 2 1, so interview in 1 month, 2 months with no interview, and then an interview again. But the 5 in brackets is because that happens on 5 occasions. So this is 5 quarterly interviews, 5 monthly interviews, each a quarter apart. And We can also think about a survey which re-interviews the same people each year. If I'm thinking in months, that means 1 month they get an interview, 11 months without, and then the next month there's an interview again. So 1, 11, 1, and I can have 6 years in a row, and that's the design for the European Union's Survey of Income and Living Conditions. And we can look in this table at the monthly overlap for those 4 different designs. And we can see that the Australian LFS has very high monthly overlap, quite high quarterly overlap, and no annual overlap at all. The UK Labour Force Survey has no monthly overlap because the same people aren't getting interviewed in consecutive months, but it's very good for quarterly overlap, and it has some annual overlap. The EU Silk has good annual overlap, but no monthly or quarterly because it's designed as an annual survey. And then we have this funny design from the current population survey in the US, which has high monthly overlap, quite high annual overlap, and some quarterly overlap. So it's giving quite a lot of useful overlap at lots of different periods, but the price you pay is in this complexity in the field. So it's harder to run that operation because you have to keep track of somebody for 8 months while you're not surveying. So that's 4 different types of designs, and you can think about, if you're setting up a new survey, do you want to measure things which are good at monthly change, in which case you want monthly overlap, or annual change, in which case you want annual overlap, or do you want one of these complex designs that tries to do everything? This is a diagram which I drew a version of while I worked in the ONS, and it shows time going across the top here, and this is in quarters. So because the LFS is really a quarterly survey, I'm thinking only in quarters this time. And then down the y-axis, I have the different cohorts. So we can see that this particular cohort is started in the survey in year 1, quarter 1. It's interviewed each quarter for 5 quarters, and then it drops off and they don't get interviewed anymore. The next cohort starts in the next quarter. Again, they're interviewed for 5 quarters and then they drop off. And that carries on all the way down the diagram, all the way to the bottom. The reason for presenting this one is that we can see which cases from this type of diagram are available for different scenarios. So the standard production of information from the Labour Force Survey in the UK takes a single quarter's information. So that's the 5th time the first cohort is in, and the 4th time the second cohort is in the sample, and so on down to the first. So I end up with 5 cohorts contributing to 1 quarter's worth of information, and that's cross-sectional. Then I can think about what happens in a year. So I can take all of the cases which are observed independently, and if I take all of the wave 5s, so that's all the ones here in their last period during a particular year, year 2 in this case, and all of the wave 1s in the same year, then they don't overlap. That gives me a very good amount of information. Each case is only observed once, so I can see that I have 8. Now I could include the extra information in here, but I don't gain very much from doing that. It gives me extra complexity. So that's the 1 year approach. And then I can think about estimating longitudinally. So if I'm thinking about 1 year changes from the beginning of quarter 1 in year 2 to quarter 1 in year 3, then it's only one of the cohorts that gives me that specific annual change. So I get less information about the annual overlaps in those cases. So I would recommend to draw diagrams like this for a new design and see how things work out. Okay, so that's talked a little bit about those rotating panel designs, but the sample design has all the usual challenges in addition to those. So I still have to decide what units I want to follow. It's households or people or something slightly more complex. I need to choose stratifiers to try and reduce the variability, concentrate the sample in some high variance strata, and typically those stratifiers will be geographic because that's the type of information we have available. But there's the greater use of administrative data in recent years means that there are more possibilities for stratifiers, and the more we can find stratifiers which are well correlated with the variables we want to measure in the survey, then it's more likely we can produce a design which will have low variance or low cost or some trade-off of the two. We probably also want some clustering in the design for operational efficiency, especially if we have to do face-to-face interviewing. Not so bad if it's telephone or something similar. And then we have all the usual questions about how many cases per cluster and how many clusters, and making the design self-weighting to try to make the analysis easy. Now, clustering is affected a little bit by the longitudinal design as well, because we have things called following rules, and we can wonder about who to follow. We can follow addresses, and this is the UK labour force survey type approach, which is operationally much more straightforward because an address doesn't move. It's always the same place whenever you go to interview it. So that means the clustering is maintained. The cases you have to interview are in the same place geographically, and that keeps the clustering going. But if people move, then that reduces the number of people who match between two periods. So those movers don't match, but their household characteristics may be relatively similar because similar households tend to live in similar types of accommodations. But because I reduced the number of match cases here, then I reduced that covariance, which was helping me to make estimates of change as accurately as possible. So that's one option, and that's the UK Labour Force Survey goes that way, always interviews at the same address, regardless of which people are there. We could instead follow people. So I could identify some people and get an interview in the first time I go, and then when I go the second time, I discover that they've moved somewhere else, and then I can try to go to where they've moved to and follow the same people again. And then the clustering breaks down. That's more complicated. And if I'm following people in that way, then the people who I managed to interview the first time, they're original sample members. But maybe I want to include people who are now living with original sample members. So maybe the sample gets a bit bigger. And there are various possibilities about how to do that. So one radical proposal is that you might follow all the people who have ever been included in your sample, in which case the sample gets quite a lot bigger, probably. Or if the sample grows slower than your attrition, maybe it only replaces the cases that you already lost. So there's some interesting questions about who to follow, how to do it, and what that means for your sample size. Okay, so now I think about design variables when I've got a survey which collects lots of information on lots of different topics. So I'd really like to have auxiliary variables for stratification, which are connected with correlated with the survey or outcome variables. Now, if I've got a really multi-purpose survey collecting lots of different variables, I'm unlikely to have a high correlation between my auxiliary data and all or even many of the variables that are in the survey. So I need a strategy. And one strategy is to pick out a few, which might be a very few, key variables and to use those in the design. So talked about income and well-being as possibilities here. Well, maybe income is a really important variable and I'd like to design for that. I could take some of those outcome variables and then form principal components to get an idea of the main axis of variation and then design on the principal components, and that's been suggested a few times. I could maybe design for an average of the variances of different variables, or I could maybe average across different designs. So it's no guarantee in any of those averaging type scenarios that the design that I end up with will necessarily be good for everything, but it's certainly an approach which provides something which won't be too bad. There are some modern methods as well. So people have been thinking that maybe there are complex relationships which would be better at stratification, and that machine learning or similar approaches might be a way to find those. And maybe there's a way to deal with lots of stratification variables and lots of outcome variables. And so people have been thinking about using genetic algorithms, which is a computer-intensive way of searching the stratification space, to try and find a really good stratification setup that works for lots of different variables. Those have mainly been applied in business surveys so far, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be used in household surveys as well. So there's a couple of references at the bottom here, which may be interesting to look at, that specify how this works. And we can think a bit about well-being variables. Those are really tricky variables because they're not necessarily well correlated with other variables that you get in a survey. So we know that income and poverty and deprivation and lots of other similar sorts of variables go together, but quite often they don't go so well with well-being. So having a survey which measures well-being and something else may give you an extra challenge. I'm going to go fast over this bit. I need to design using some past or pilot information, and that requires some stability. And in practice, I never quite achieve the accuracy that the design says I should get. But that's just how life is. And I need to account for things that I know are going to happen. So I can't just design a sample imagining that everyone will respond, because I know they won't. So then I have to account for differential non-response, which parts of the population are most likely to respond and which are not, and also for attrition, people who are going to drop out before they get to the end of the panel. That means I need to oversample those types of cases which are more likely to not respond or more likely to drop out, and then I need good predictors for those types of cases too. So all of that information ought to feed into a design. And then I have a last thought here that I need to do that oversampling, but that means that I'll have some weights that are bigger than others, and the variation in the weights affects the overall variance. So you have to trade off the two things here, one about oversampling to make sure I have enough cases, and one about not wanting to oversample so differentially that I create a lot of variability in the weights. Okay, so that was design, panels, and then stratification and clustering, following rules, and multi-purpose designs. And let me pass swiftly onwards. If I have a survey that I've set up and run in the field, I'm bound to get some non-response, and that means I need to do some type of imputation. We know about cross-sectional imputation, which relies on some models which are finding the association between missing data and some auxiliary variables that I have, and those auxiliary variables should be associated both with the missing data and with the non-response propensity in order to be good variables for non-response adjustment. And I should use stochastic imputation, in other words, a random imputation type process, so that I preserve the relationships between variables. And we have a sequence of imputing variables. Can't do a whole survey in one go, have to do related blocks. So I need to impute again some key variables first. And if I really want to understand the variability that arises from imputation, then I might want to do a multiple imputation process. And I'll come back to that when I talk about users just at the end. In a longitudinal survey, I have some distinct advantages, because after the first occasion when I surveyed somebody, they already answered lots of questions. So I already know a lot about the respondents, which I can use to construct a model to predict what they would say next time if they're missing from the survey on the next occasion. So in principle, I may be able to find some stronger relationships because I have this good data. But there are also some challenges. It's a question about whether imputation only goes forwards ever in the data. So you impute from the first occasion when somebody's interviewed to the second occasion when they might be missing, or do you allow them to go backwards as well? So if there was interviewed on occasion 1, missing on occasion 2, and interviewed on occasion 3, then occasion 3 also provides you some information about what the missing value on occasion 2 is likely to have been. So do you allow that when occasion 3 arises to revise the previous imputations? So that opens up the whole question about whether you revise your data. We're also interested in finding donor records, and if I'm matching on longitudinal patterns, imagine for a moment it's that Australian labour force survey and it's an in for 8 design. and at the 8th period, the 8th occasion, a household doesn't respond, then I want to find another household that has the same pattern of employment or unemployment or something similar that might be a good predictor for the previous 7 periods. So that's 7 variables that I'm trying to match on before I even start. So that the matches for longitudinal patterns generally mean that I get fewer donors. Still going. Emilio's looking at me, but 5 more minutes, Emilio. Then estimation. So again, I know how to do cross-sectional estimation with calibration, and compensates for differential sampling and for unit non-response. I might need to do a weight share. So if I'm following people in those following rules, where I wanted an original sample member and then I follow them to a new household and find the people who are newly living with them, those new people need some weight. And that might need a weight share process. And the reference at the bottom of the screen here is a book all about weight share methods. For longitudinal weighting, I have multiple periods, but maybe fewer of the waves in the rotating paddle contributing. Think back to my LFS diagram, which had just the single cohort. So only cases which have the whole longitudinal history are included in my data. That means I need to compensate for the attrition, and that's usually done with a model. And again, I have lots of previous data from modeling, so it's easy to do that. And I might need the weight share. Once I've done all this nice weighting, we've got different methods that might be used, then I'm interested in estimating change from my survey. And I can do that by looking at the 2 cross sections at time 1 and time 2. But maybe I want to make more use of the overlap. So I can have composite estimators. So I can think about just using the 2 cross sections, which is this part, or I could think about just using the common units, time 1 and time 2. The C subscript here is for common. And this one's a little bit biased because it leaves out the people who start anew and the people who drop out. But it has much lower variance because the Y's are measured on the same units. So I might be able to combine those 2 estimates in a composite estimator. And there are ways to push that back through the calibration so that you end up with a consistent set of weights that you can use everywhere. You have to be just careful that those don't drift away from the target. Because there's a little bit of bias in here, they may drift over a long period and maybe need to benchmark them. This is really interesting, but I'm going to skip it. No, let me do this one. The UK Labour Force Survey has this 3 monthly structure where households are interviewed every 3 months. So it produces 3 monthly rolling estimates. So in April, it produces a set of estimates for January, February and March. And then in May, it produces another set for February, March and April. And those rolling 3-month periods are really supported by this 1-to-1 type design. And the reference at the bottom says that. And then in the Netherlands, the Dutch Labour Force Survey takes that a stage further and produces a state-space model for the trend based on the information in each cohort, which they use then to deal with rotational group bias as well, which is a bias that says the response depends on when somebody's in what occasion somebody is answering the survey for. So they answer differently if it's the first occasion than they do if it's the second occasion. That model for the LFS in the Netherlands needs regular checking, but it's used for the headline outputs. I know they've had big challenges dealing with the impact of Corona on that model because it takes what happens in history and uses it to project forwards.
Sorry, Professor, we have 2 more minutes.
Yes, I'm going to drop some slides and then go. It's okay. So let me leave that one. I'm going to leave that one. Well-being I already mentioned and said about the challenge of finding good predictors, but well-being might also get measured on an interesting scale. So in the UK there are 10-point scales and those provide extra complexity in the modelling. For users, there's presumably some plan for releasing anonymised microdata. And here the multiple imputation comes back. So multiple imputation is a challenge for users and they may need to be sophisticated people, or they may need to have sophisticated tools just to help them if multiple imputation is in use. And just a warning that for longitudinal type surveys, for panel surveys, data sets, I'm getting an echo. They may have several output files with lots of different weights, and it's a challenge for users to select the correct data. We know already from some big longitudinal studies in the UK.
Please, can all the participants mute the microphone? Please, Professor, go on.
Yes, okay. So there's a challenge for users to select the correct data for the analysis they want to do and the correct set of weights. And there are lots of examples of people not doing exactly the right thing. So don't underestimate how difficult it might be for users to understand which piece they need to use. So just to conclude, longitudinal surveys have all these complex design options, more than in a standard cross-sectional survey. We have the complexity of how to deal with multiple variables, and we have multiple types of outcomes, cross-sectional ones, longitudinal ones, and gross flows, which I didn't really mention. The repeated collection means that I have lots of variables available for modelling imputation and attrition and doing the weighting. And it's a real challenge amongst all of those things to educate the users to make the best use of the data, even if you're doing a really good job in providing it. There we go. I hope that gives you some food for thought. So now I'll stop sharing the slides and start looking at the questions.
All right. Well, before we move on to questions and answers, I would like to thank you, Professor Paul Smith, for this interesting talk. And we will begin with the questions. I have here one question from Gerardo Leiva. And it says, well, you mentioned some strategies, and which of these alternative design strategies will you say is better for a general social survey, and why?
Yes, I mentioned lots of design strategies, and I'm not sure which ones this question precisely refers to. But if I have a design strategy, this is probably around which variables to design on. So for a general social survey, there may be some variables you can point to which are well correlated with a range of other variables. So I pointed at maybe income and poverty and deprivation and overcrowding. I can think of a range of variables which all tend to occur together in the same sorts of places. And then it would be a good strategy to pick one variable from that group and to use that in a design. But if you have a survey which is collecting over lots of different types of variables, then it's more complicated, and it may be you want something which is much less targeted, so there's less risk to get a sample which doesn't measure a particular variable well. So if the sample's more spread, then it would have a better chance to measure all of the variables as well as possible.
Okay, thanks. Well, I have one question about the measurement of income. Have you observed a differentiated response rate between groups, and how did you surpass it? I'm asking more things than just oversampling.
Yeah, income is tricky because there are groups of people who don't like to tell you their income. So even in a survey which gets quite good response, there is more non-response on the income question than anywhere else. So oversampling isn't the answer because you don't get all of the detail. So you hope maybe that imputation gets you part of the story if you get enough response. But probably a better strategy is if you're able to link your survey with administrative sources in some way and get, if not the actual income information, which might be in the admin source rather slowly, you may be able to get a good predictor from administrative information from a previous year. and that might be a much better way to fill in some of these particularly difficult missing values.
Okay. Well, I have another question here from Delfino Vargas. Imputation methods are recommended as a regular methodology of analysis. Which method do you suggest that has better results?
Yeah, so there are lots of different ways to do imputation, and it's very hard to recommend a specific one in it without knowing details of a case. But there are various bits of software. There's one from the Canadians called CanCeis, C-A-N-C-E-I-S, which is a very flexible donor-based imputation system, which seems to have very good results. So there should be ways to use that to construct a good process for imputation in a big data set. And it is complicated because you have to do chunks of variables together. You can't do the whole thing in one go, it's too big.
Here there is another question. Is it correct to use the design weights for estimation purposes when using data from a retrospective longitudinal survey?
I lost Emilio. Can you still hear me?
Yes, you can. We can hear you, Professor.
Okay, yes. Then I'll read the question from the screen and answer it also.
Sorry, my internet is terrible.
Yeah, okay.
It was the question. It was, is it correct to use the design weights for estimation purposes when using data from a retrospective longitudinal survey? Isn't weighting variable in time?
Yeah, the weighting does vary by time. So now life gets complicated. So I can make a cross-sectional weight at one time. I'm sorry, my hands, waving my hands. I'm not sure it helps. I can make a cross-sectional weights at one time and at another time, and I can just look at the estimates. But if I really want a longitudinal data set, then I have to deal with the difference in the two times, and I can construct a single weight that will work for the cases that are available at both time periods. But then I have to adjust in some way for the cases that weren't available. I can't observe those cases. I don't observe them. So I have to assume that the ones I do see are like the ones that I don't see. And then I have to construct a weight for my longitudinal data set and make estimates from the longitudinal data set, which now has a consistent weight.
Okay. Well, here it is another one from Negrete Prieto Rodriguez. Please elaborate a little bit more on the challenges posed by subjective well-being surveys in using 0 to 10 scales.
Yeah. So let's take it may not be a sensible example, but it's quite a good one. So imagine that I use a regression process to do imputation. So I look at the characteristics of a certain household which didn't respond to my well-being question, and I say, let me put those predictors into a regression equation, and maybe my regression equation says that their well-being should be 11.5. Well, that's clearly silly. So I need a process which allows me to model in a way that will only produce a value between 0 and 10. And that might be an ordinal type regression where I treat each category as a separate outcome, or I might use some version of a logistic regression which is bounded between 0 and 10. So that those sorts of extra complications in the models are needed to make sure that I keep something that stays within the bounds.
And here it is another one of incentives. Do you use incentives to increase response and maintain cooperation? And what are the implications for the sampling design?
Yep. So different surveys have different approaches, and I can talk about examples where we do use incentives and examples where incentives don't get used. The challenge for design is more around what you expect in terms of response And there's also an interesting question about what's the most efficient in money terms. So is it better to issue 100,000 cases and not pay them anything? Or is it better to issue 50,000 cases and use the saved 50,000 to encourage the cases you do actually go to respond? So those sorts of things will affect the types of areas where you oversample to make sure you have enough cases.
Okay, well, here it is another one from Alfonso Miranda. Thinking in general, catch-all survey. How do you decide how long an interview is too long to keep cooperation? And how do you decide how much detail you should have in each topic?
Yeah, there's a tricky question. I'm not sure I'm the perfect person to answer, but I think you have to have a feel for the sort of length of interview that you can manage in a household, which might be 30 or 40 minutes at maximum. And then once you have that, then you have to estimate how long each question takes to answer. And maybe if you have computer-assisted interviewing tools, that you get some of that information as part of the computer program that helps you do the interviews. And then that will feed back into how much detail you can ask on each topic. So there are some examples. The UK Labour Force Survey, I think, has had an average time when it was face-to-face of about 40 minutes, but it's had to be reduced because a lot of that has moved onto the web. There are examples of surveys that took longer. In particular, there's a wealth and assets survey, which I think had an interview length around an hour because it asked quite a lot of detailed income questions. Income and assets questions. So those sorts of things depend a little bit on the topic of the survey as well.
Okay, here it is one interesting question about the weights. When estimating gross flows in labor market, you have to compare households with different final weights. How do you deal with this difference in weights?
Yeah, so for gross flows, again, I need a longitudinal data set because I need to know the state at the beginning of the period and the state at the end of the period where I want to calculate a gross flow. So I want to construct a single data set that has all of that information in. And then I want to weight this new combined data set. So I want a single set of longitudinal weights and not the two cross-sectional weights in order to calculate a set of gross flows.
Okay. And well, here it's in Brazil, we have a 1-for-1 survey design, and I want to combine interviews 5 of each year. Do you have some advice or material about this kind of combination?
My advice is to draw my type of diagram again. And you can see how that works. So 1-for-1 is funny because it's.
It means that it seems that
5 months apart.
Every 5 months. It should be every 6 months.
Every 6 months.
I guess.
Yeah. Oh, 1, 2, 1, 5.
There is
That
1,
is better.
2, 1. Oh, okay.
Okay. Then that's exactly the situation that I had in my slides. If it's 1, 2, 1, 5. So if you want to look at interviews 1 and 5 in each year, I'm trying to go back to my slide.
Okay.
My screen again. Hang on. Here we are. So that's this one. So this is those cells there are the interviews at the 5th occasion. And these ones here are the interviews on the 1st occasion. Combine all those and you get a 1 year's worth of data set. Is that the right question that I'm answering?
I'm not sure, but it seems that maybe they have to use the same strategy to create a combined data set. But I'm not sure.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And here it is another one. What do you think of the possibilities in using or combining admin data with survey-based methodologies?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I tend to be a little bit skeptical about the administrative data. The people who work in official statistics seem to be much more driven to use it, I think partly politically and because of money. I think that administrative data is fantastic for modelling and prediction, but it's not always exactly what you want to replace a survey variable. So I think the possibilities for combining administrative data in a way that uses them as predictors and auxiliary variables and stratification variables and those things should allow us to do surveys design much more efficiently, but it isn't the answer to measuring all the variables you want in a survey.
Okay. Well, here I have a question which I know it is difficult, but in your experience, what would be a useful longitudinal design for capturing well-being?
Yeah, that's also a tricky question. So well-being, the evidence that I know so far is that it doesn't change very rapidly, although I think that's been a bit different during the corona crisis. So the corona situation has changed views of the world, I think, about how surveys work. So in a steady state, I might only want to have a quarterly overlap because I don't think that well-being is going to change very quickly. In which case, a longitudinal design that goes back to the same people, the same households every quarter, a bit like the LFS, might give you quite good information. But if you're worried that well-being might change relatively quickly, then perhaps you want a monthly design instead. Or perhaps it's one of those things that's not strongly monitored as part of government policy, in which case an annual design may be enough.
Okay. And I think Alfredo Bustos, here is a question. When you have a long history for a survey, shouldn't you use at least part of it to combine with your more recent collections?
Yes, I think using history is a good idea. So the slide that I went over rather quickly about modelling is in fact the Dutch approach is using a lot of the history to generate a time series model, which then allows you to make good estimates at the current time using all of the information about how the panel survey evolves as the time goes on. So I think that there's a lot that you can understand from the history, especially of these types of rotating surveys, which is very important. So I think that's a good observation.
Thank you. Well, in one of your last slides, you mentioned educating practitioners and users of this information. And maybe you can do a sophisticated sampling design, a very good quality survey, but this information, then it will be used by practitioners and users. And how can you please elaborate on this, educating the users of this longitudinal information?
Yes. So a lot of these types of surveys, part of the function is just to produce aggregate information, which is used in monitoring and such things. But there will always be users who want the detailed microdata, and if those are made available, particularly for a rotating panel, then you get lots of different types of data sets. So you will have a cross-sectional data set for a particular quarter. You might have one of these aggregate data sets for a year, which has wave 1 and wave 5 cases in. You may have a 1-year transition. You may have a 1-quarter transition. And all of those data sets have a different set of weights, they have a different set of cases, and they probably have a different set of variables. But for any particular user who comes in, some will be sophisticated and understand all those things, but there will be a lot of users who don't, who just want to come along and answer a specific research question. And there are lots of examples of people doing that by taking the first data set they find or the data set they're most familiar with, even when they know it's not right. When I used to work in the ONS, we had two types of labour force survey, one for people and one for households. And even the person in the Treasury, the government department, which analysed a lot of that information, said I quite often take the wrong data set, even though I know I shouldn't, because I know how to analyse the other one. So there will be users out there who take the wrong data set or don't use the weights or use the wrong weight or do all of those things. And there's a real challenge about making it easy for the users to understand which data set they should use to answer a particular question and how they should analyze it.
Okay. Well, it seems, is there any other question, or do you have any further comment, Professor?
There's a lot of good questions there, and I've gone through both my slides and the responses to the questions really fast. So if anyone wants to email me afterwards and ask a more detailed question, then they're welcome to do that.
Well, okay. So it seems there is no more questions. And, oh, here it is. It is another one. How important is to create a survey methodology research team in universities and institutes to create capacity to do surveys? I think he's talking about this symbiotic relationship between Southampton and ONS, for example.
Yes, and I've been on both sides of that relationship, so I've seen it for a long time. So surveys should only be done by ONS, it says in the chat. Not necessarily so, because there are some big longitudinal surveys which are funded by research councils here. But the official statistics surveys, yes, they should be done by the statistical system. But it is important for a national statistical office to have a methodology team which understands the theory behind the processes that it uses, and so that it uses the most up-to-date and efficient methods, because that's part of how to spend public money in a good way to get the right sorts of outcomes. So I think it's really important to have a team like that inside a National Statistical Institute. And the link between the ONS and Southampton has been a really important way to make that team gain more skills, to be able to call on specialists with particular knowledge in the university. So I think it's been an extremely valuable relationship, and we can see that other countries have started to do those sorts of things. So it's I would say that it was really important to have the research on both sides to encourage universities to do more and to set up the teams inside the NSIs to understand the methods.
All right, thank you. Well, it looks we are on time. Is there any other question? Oh, there is no questions. Well, to close today's lecture, we want to thank you again, Professor, for your stimulating presentation. And I guess we can finish the presentation. Is there any further comment or question in the audience?
Yes, I would like to ask to thank Professor Paul Smith, and also tell you that presentations will be uploaded in our website, and we'll still have some more lectures going on. So if you would like to join us, please. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Oh, here it is, another last one.
Oh.
How to maintain a panel survey in the framework of COVID without face-to-face interviews? Well,
Yes. Well, I'm not the expert on this either because I don't do direct interviews, but a lot of it has moved on online or on telephones, which requires some way of getting in touch with the household or the location you want to respond. I think that's been a huge challenge for lots of different surveys. There was a special issue of Survey Research Methods, which is an online free-access journal about exactly that, which came out about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh, here it is. Very last one. Can you please elaborate a little bit about socio-demographic characteristic of each cohort panel? Okay, well, this might be specific to the country, but do you have any ideas about this question?
I don't quite understand what it's asking, I think. So each of the little cohorts in my panel design should be nationally representative, so they're not different. Each one is a random or stratified random sample from the whole population. So that always we have a nationally representative sample as we go through these rotating panel surveys.
Well, I think we can finish the meeting. So thank you very much, Professor Paul Smith, and thank you all for coming. Have a nice weekend. Thank you. I will end the meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.